Steve, you sound great, and you are broadcasting from where?
New York.
Oh, New York, yeah, of course. And you could never, as our listeners could never tell by your accent. So, yes. I'm a business owner myself. Actually, it's part of the business is owned by a family as well. So I'm partners with two brothers that are part of the same family. So I've dealt with the succession planning. That my original partner was the father, and then now I'm in business with two of his children. And so I've kind of gone through a lot of this, but I'm fascinated by, here we are. I want to talk about entrepreneurship. I want to talk about business. There's so many transactions that have been happening in America around me. I've had multiple clients or multiple families that I've worked with sell businesses over the last couple of years. Multiple are selling right now. And it seems like the environment is very rich for transactions. So what are you seeing?
Well, that's 100% true. I mean, at every level, there's a lot of dry powder out there that people want to put and invest somewhere. That you can't earn anything on your money in fixed income. People are hesitant to put so much of their money in the market. So there's a lot of people who want to invest in private companies, whether it's buying them or investing in them. So a lot of people are seeing dollars they never thought they can get for their businesses. And who knows, it could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so people are jumping
So you help families go through the transition, and whether it be a privately held business that is going to go to the next generation, or the employees, or just a regular outside buyer, or I guess in some cases a private equity fund. What have you seen over the last couple of years? Is it kind of all the above type of transactions, and any particular industries, by the way?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm pretty much involved in a lot of different industries, but I would say to you that employees is tough, unless it's a big enough company. Maybe you're doing an ESOP, but normally the employees don't have the capital to make the acquisition. So if there's a family business, generally they're going to pass it down to the next generation, unless dad has issues with the kids, or doesn't feel the kids are equipped to run it, or the kids are not sure they want to run it, and a big enough check is offered. There's a price for everything. So if there's enough money on the table, even with a family business, you may take the check. You have to be careful with that, because if you're 70 years old and you got kids who are 40 and they've invested 15 years of their life in a business, and you still own it, and you still the company, and you get all the money, you got your kids who are now 40 years old who could be out of a job, and they're not getting any of the money. So, you have to factor that in as a parent, when you have a family business. But where there's no kids involved, certainly if somebody offers somebody the right amount of money, it's hard to say no.
And a lot of this leads to somebody who, at any age, I mean, I've seen this now in people in their 40s. We hear technology stories where people are cashing out and they're in their 20s, 30s. But if you're, let's say, outside of tech and you didn't invent Facebook, something brand new, I see lots of businesses and people in their 40s and 50s or 60s that are selling. But people, younger than retirement age, in just the last year or so, I've had folks sell insurance businesses, a big fire safety business, air conditioning, real estate brokerage, commercial building. My own dad sold his veterinary practice about a year and a half ago, right before.
A lot of roll. There's a lot of private equity buying veterinary practices.
Exactly. Now, he was so adamant to not do that, by the way. He was so against private equity. He's like a cowboy. He's like, I'm not going to let these, private equity firms come in and buy me. So he actually found an individual veterinarian that wanted to buy practice. So I think he actually took less money. He took like $200,000 less to sell it to an individual so that he didn't let a private equity firm buy him, by the way.
How's your dad going to feel a year later when that guy sells it to a private equity?
So, yeah, you're right. I don't even know if he'll know. He's so moved on to the next chapter. But so why don't we maybe just talk about that? Is that you mentioned that there's a lot of dry powder out there. I want to explore that for a minute. Is it you're seeing? I just gave a bunch of it. These are all just literally off the top of my head. These are examples of families I've worked with over the last couple of years or the last year and a half that are selling. In Europe in the Northeast, are you seeing any particular industry or what is driving people? What is driving this surge? Is it private equity? Is it individuals saying they want to go buy a business? Who is the buyer, Steve?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I think that, look, the wealthy people, the more sophisticated investors have money to invest, and they are putting more and more of that money into alternative investments, private equity, hedge funds, venture capital. And when these funds keep raising bigger and bigger funds, there's more and more money to then go out and invest. And there's only so many giant companies. So they have to go and find other companies out there to invest this money. And a lot of companies, especially not necessarily like tech, but it could be an e-commerce company that sells children's food in a subscription model. Most companies, when you think of buying like a transaction, you say, I got a company, it does $20 million in revenue. I make $2 million of profit, EBITDA, and somebody's going to pay me 5 times EBITDA, so I'm going to get $10 million for my business. That's how you think. Today, because I invest in a lot of venture funds and venture companies, you could have a company doing $20 million of sales that's an e-commerce children's food company, and it doesn't even make money. It's losing money because they're reinvesting so much into marketing and, trying to buy business through Facebook and Google. That company could sell for 5 times sales, could sell for like $100 million. So a company doing 20 million of revenue, losing 5 million a year, could sell for $100 million, while a traditional company doing 20 million of revenue, making $2 million, could sell for $10 million. That's kind of what's out there today. And people are not just buying, they're investing. Like they're raising money for a company at $100 million value that's doing 20 million of sales that doesn't make any money, because the thought is that 20 is going to grow to 50, and then most of their expenses, if they're bought by a big company like a Mars or a Chewy or one of these companies, like they're going to take the 50 million of revenue. Let's say the gross margins 60%, so they're making 30 million gross margin. Most of the other expenses go away. So they're buying a company that they already have, they could cover all the other expenses. So they're taking a company did 50 of revenue, losing money, but to them, they're making $30 million on that company because all the other expenses below the gross profit margin number, they could take over. They have that overhead already.
Yeah, because they already have other divisions that can come in and pay for that. It's really it's an economies of scale issue, right?
So now they're really buying a company that's making $30 million, that's growing, and they're saying, well, I'll pay $200 million for that company because I think it's going to grow to $100 million of sales and it's going to make $60 million. So it's worth it. So there's so much of that going on today. And look, somebody could get caught holding the bag at some point. Somebody keeps investing at this, and somewhere down the road, the formula changes. And now you have these venture funds investing in companies that they may never even get 50% of their money back. But so far, I've seen for myself, I've invested in companies that have sold, and I sit there and scratch my head sometime and go, I wouldn't pay $300 million for this company, but somebody did.
Well, maybe if we take a step back, so we think for our audience, Steve, and this is to me is such a, I love this topic about private equity because we spend so much time on stocks and individual stocks, and this company's doing this, and this company's doing that, and they have this much in revenue, and this much is in EBITDA, and we're buying and selling these companies at X amount times, let's call it profits or earnings. But and you hear the word PE, private equity, but it's so non-transparent, right? I mean, you see a company that's traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and you kind of know what it does. You can look at its financials. Private equity, not just private equity, but private companies. I don't know if I don't know if most people have an appreciation of just the actual dynamics of these individual private companies. So maybe explain to us, why would you buy a $20 million transportation company or a $50 million manufacturing company? And who is that buyer? If it's not PE, or it's not private equity, it's not just a big fund, are there just other competitors coming in and buying you? And maybe just walk us through an example of why that's a good investment relative to just owning a stock.
Well, look, first off, the buyers generally are private equity and strategic buyers, companies that see a strategic benefit to buying that company. So the reasons they're going to buy the company, that they make a decision to buy the company, is it's either getting them into a market they're not in, that they want to be in, either from a demographic standpoint, a part of the country standpoint, or
geographically,
a particular niche within an industry. Like, I'm rolling up veterinary practices, and I'm also going to roll up some dog food companies, or insurance company that sells pet insurance, so it has symmetry with a lot of the other companies that are in their portfolio, or if it's a company buying these that has divisions that do these things. The second thing is, which really goes back to the private equity, it's like you mentioned earlier about your dad was a vet. So like private equity's rolling up veterinary practices. So what they'll do is they'll pay 5 times EBITDA to the owner of the veterinary practice, 5 times. Then they put them all together, and then they find a buyer that buys the aggregate for 10 times EBITDA. Mm-hmm. So if they do nothing, if they're no more profitable than the original owner was, they may be able to sell that company for double in a 5-year period of time. Plus they put leverage on it, so it magnifies their return. And that's the kind of stuff that's going on today.
Well, and that's where, and maybe we'll just walk through this for our audience, that's where multiples come in, right? So if one firm in a private setting is paying 5 times, and which would be a pretty, I would say historically, pretty reasonable range, 5 times profits you pay, right? Or 5 to 7 times profits, that means that you pay $100 million for something, you should be getting back your $100 million within, even if you don't grow, within 5 years, right? Which is for longer term investors. And I think that's the other distinction here for private equity and private investors. These are longer term deals, right? It may take 5 years, it may take 7 years for private equity to have their investment come to fruition. And it's not very liquid during that period of time. I mean, you can't just buy and sell a veterinary practice in the middle of rural southeastern Pennsylvania like you can a stock. It's the opposite of that. It's very illiquid. It takes a long time to find a buyer and a long time to put these companies together. But when you do, if you can then find, let's say, the marketplace puts a greater value, perhaps it's a publicly traded company that now trades at 15 times profits. To your point, you can get a bunch of smaller companies, put them together, 5 times EBITDA, and then find a buyer at a larger scale, because the market likes a larger scale, less single company or single location risk, and they pay 10 times profits or 15. And I think that's what you're kind of how you're describing this, but it's not something that gets talked about on CNBC a lot.
Yeah, I mean, true. I mean, on programs like CNBC, you're mostly talking about public companies or Bitcoin or something like that. That's what's or meme stocks and GameStop and AMC theaters and Robinhood and stuff. I mean, but
Well, and another thought for a couple of years ago, I think it was back in 2017, 18, I wrote a bunch about the declining number of stocks. I think I wrote an article, where do all the stocks go? And we went from 8,000 companies down to, on the NYSE, down to 3,500. Even the Wilshire 5,000 index doesn't even have 5,000 companies anymore. And a lot of that is to two or three big companies get together. Now they're one. We hear these giant mergers, right? AT&T now owns Turner, and they own, which used to be, or AT&T owns now Turner and HBO and all these other companies, all in just one company now. So there's less companies out there to choose from. Private equity kind of opens that world back up to you as an investor. If you've got patience to be able to have a company kind of come to fruition over 3, 5, 7 years, the rates of return within private equity, to your point, can be really, really attractive.
well,
So
Wes, just mention a point that I think is actually a very good point. I think the combination of less stocks out there for the reason you said, a lot of companies have either been bought by other public companies or taken private, plus all the stock buybacks that companies have done because they view that that's the best way to deploy their capital. You end up with less companies and less public shares of each of those companies. That's part of why the stock market's gone up in value.
right.
A certain amount of money that people, every day that goes by, more money is looking for an investment in the stock market. And if there's less shares and less companies, there's more money going after those limited number of companies and shares. It's supply and demand. Price is going to go up. I mean, besides the Fed and interest rates, which have a lot to do with it also. But that is another reason why. Now, SPACs and there's been a big IPO splurge lately, and SPACs, you're starting to find some of the opposite, that some of the private companies that have been raising money, a lot of these venture companies that have been raising money, that last raise that used to be like their Series E or F raise privately, now with SPACs, although SPACs have now had some issues, that last raise became a public raise instead of a private raise. So you're starting to find some of the private coming back into the public, but it's going to take a long time to get it back to where it was at one point in time.
Super important point. And for our audience listening, what Steve's talking about here is the SPACs are these special purpose acquisition companies that are stock. I look at SPACs as kind of venture capital on steroids, to your point. Instead of, it's almost multiple rounds of financing in one and going public all at the same time. So they find a target. The stock, which is the SPAC, is already trading. It's got 100, 200, 300 million in cash. It finds a target. They combine. And as long as everybody votes yes, you've got the widget company and the cash, and now you're public. And now you can access millions of shareholders, but you have that cash that was originally in that SPAC, just like a venture capital fund would have done, to inject the cash to really accelerate growth. And I think we've had something like, I was looking at this just this week, Steve, is that I think we got down to like 3,400 stocks because of all the mergers and taking private, lack of IPOs, and because of SPACs in the last couple of years, it's back to like 3,800. I think we've had like 400 combinations in the last 2 years, somewhere around there. So it's fascinating to me, but I'm always thinking for entrepreneurs out there, or people thinking about buying or starting a company, when it comes to that, setting yourself up to sell, going to find a buyer, maybe selling to, or just then passing on the next generation, let's talk some of that through. What do you need to do as a business owner to start thinking about the moving on and making a sale?
Well, I think one of the first things that any business owner should do is look at their company as if they were going to buy it. You know, what would you were looking at your company not as a seller but as a buyer, and think through what what would make you more comfortable to buy a company? Because you have to assume if you're a smart entrepreneur, the person who's going to be on the other side of the transaction is going to think that way. So I think that's always a good exercise for somebody to do. I mean, obviously, if you're looking to sell your company, especially if you're a fairly nice sized company and you're looking to get some nice amount of money, you have to have a reputable accounting firm. You want to have a reputable law firm. You're going to start needing audited financial statements. You may have to switch from like a subchapter S corporation, which is more like a piggy bank, into a C corporation. You have to take a look at all your piggy bank stuff you've had in your company and say, I may have to stop doing some of those things for a period of years so it's a more legitimate income statement.
Explain that. When you're saying piggy bank things in the company to our listeners, what do you explain what you're talking about?
Everybody who owns a business, just about, puts certain things through the business that are, let's just say, somewhat personal in nature.
Sure. Yeah.
Whether
like going out to eat is an example, right? This is on the company, right?
Food, every dinner, your cars, some of your insurance, you buy clothing. I needed it for business, for meetings, you travel. So, obviously a sophisticated buyer and his advisors or her advisors are going to cut through that crap. But the cleaner you make it, the less of that, the better it's going to be for the buyer to feel that there's a real legitimate business here that they could really put their hands around. So the other thing is going to be, you have to be realistic about, are you just going to get a check and leave? Is somebody going to just write you a check? Or is there going to be some seller financing where you're going to be paid off over a period of time? Or some of the money you're getting is going to be tied into meeting certain, goals and parameters? Because when you're going to buy a business, if I just give you a check and you leave, then what recourse do I have if it turns out there was stuff I didn't really know? Then you have issues. Most people are not going to buy the stock in your company because they don't want to take on any of your liabilities and your tax risks. So they're going to buy the assets. You have to look at how that's going to be handled from a tax standpoint for both the buyer and you as the seller.
I think that's another Steve, that's a really important point that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. And it really does depend. There's so many cases, I've seen it both ways, where you have somebody come in and they really do give you money and you go away, right? Or they say, hey, I want you to consult for a year, and they really don't want you in anyway, and you're out of the picture pretty quickly. And then there are business sales that are very contingent on you staying, right? It's like, hey, no, we're going to buy you, but we don't want you to leave right now. We want you to stay for the next 3 years. Or there's been in our industry, the financial industry, I would say the more what happens more often than not, and I don't know, maybe you can. I'd love your thoughts on if this is happening in other industries. The predominant buyer wants to come in to the asset management world, the RIA world, the registered investment advisory world, and buy 50% of your business and have you continue to run it. That is the most common model that I've seen. I've had, I get an email or two every single day from one of these roll-up firms, and that's their model. Buy 40 to 50%, you keep running it. Do you see that in other industries?
Well, I think it depends on industry. Like an RIA model, let's face it, somebody's got, $500 million of assets under management, and, maybe they have 250 clients, an average of, $2 million a client. That client and the owner, there's a tight bond there. There's a trust that's been built up. I mean, if I had my money with an RIA for 10 years, 15 years, and I trust the person, and the person sells the business to you, Wes, and I don't know who you are. I've had so many people knocking on my door, but I've stayed with my guy because he's done a good job and I trust him. Mm-hmm. Once he sells to you, It's like, what allegiance do I have to you?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? I may go somewhere else. So then if I'm going to buy 100% of an RIA's practice and he leaves, I mean, there's a significant risk that there could be clients that walk out the door. So if I buy 49 or 50% of your business and I'm injecting, because sometimes it's I'm giving you money, but sometimes I'm injecting it in the business because you really want to grow it. Sometimes you want to take money off the table. RIA, it's more take money off the table because it's not a capital intensive, business. But like now I know that you're incentivized to keep these customers with me because you still own 50% of the business. They're not going to leave.
Right.
And now we're going to together build a relationship with those clients. So if 5 years from now, I want to buy your other 50%, I've now had 5 years to build a relationship with those clients. They're probably not going to leave them because they know me as well. But if I buy you and you walk out, a lot of the clients are going to walk out. Not like you being dishonest and trying to set up shop somewhere else. They're just going to say, my allegiance was to Wes. I have two buddies at my country club that have been banging on my door for 10 years that I keep saying no to because of my relationship with Wes. But once Wes sells, I'd rather go to my buddy Billy, the club, than the guy who bought Wes's practice.
Exactly. Well, let's talk about that then. Let's talk about succession. And let's talk about having, because my original business partner in the RIA that we have in Atlanta and now around the country was wanted to keep his children who were quickly becoming a very productive part of the business as well. He wanted to keep them in as well. And I worked really well with them. And that was kind of his dream, to have succession and keep this thing going. And then here we are many years later, and we've gone from it's been tremendous growth over those years. But maybe let's talk about that though. It's not always that easy. The succession with kids, dad starts the business, passes it on to the children. That is not always. In fact, I would say more times than not, that's pretty tough, isn't it?
It is. A larger percentage of my business is that situation than somebody selling their company. More.
Tell me about that.
I deal with, it's where there's a family and you want to keep it in the family. And it's complicated for a whole bunch of reasons. What I always tell people is, look, I don't know, Wes, I'm assuming you're married, you have kids. I do.
I'm married. I got 4 kids.
I got kids. Your kids 18,000 times from the time they're old enough to remember till they leave the house. They're like, well, Dad, you got my sister a phone, I want a phone, or they got a TV, I want a TV, or they're getting a car, I want a car. And you tell your kids, I love you the same. Oh, Dad, you like my sister better than me. No, I don't like your sister better. I love you all the same. He's the favorite. No, sometimes you're each a favorite for an hour, but on average, right. It averages out, Now one day you wake up and you're like, picture it, Wes. You got a nice RIA practice. Let's say you owned 100% of it. You got 3 kids. One's in the business, 2 aren't in the business. And you're 65, 70 years old. You say, holy smokes. I've been telling these 3 kids for the last 30 years how I love them the same, how I'm never going to treat any of them different from the other. And now what am I going to do? I got this big successful business. My daughter's in the business. My 2 sons didn't want to come into business. So am I going to leave the business to my 3 kids equally when 2 aren't in the business? But if I leave it to my daughter, most of my money is in the business. So I don't have enough other things to leave my other 2 kids down the road. And if I give something to my daughter today, do I have to give stuff to my other kids today? Are they going to wait till I and my wife are gone to give them the shares? So what ends up happening, especially when you have sons,
And by the way, I have 4 boys. So you're talking about me. I have an RIA practice. One of them's a guitar player at heart and probably never be in the corporate world. One of them, and two of them might want to be in the business one day. Who knows? They're young. They're still young, so I don't even know. But yeah, I'm an example. So you're talking to me, the future Wes.
So here's the thing, which doesn't happen when they're young. But when they get in their 30s, what most sons end up with is a wife. And that wife becomes your daughter-in-law. And if all of a sudden your son goes home to his wife, your daughter-in-law, and says, honey, I spoke to my dad today, and he's leaving this, he's going to transfer this business to my sister. And my dad makes a couple of $1 million a year, successful guy. And like, he told me, like, you're going to have to wait till mom and I are in here and we'll give you stuff, but it's probably not going to be anywhere near as valuable as the business. And then his daughter-in-law is like, are you kidding me? Like, your dad is going to do that? Like, son, to be honest with you, I never really loved your dad to begin with. I kind of tolerated him. But like now I'm really pissed off. And you know what? Screw your dad. I'm not letting him see the grandkids anymore. That's it. He's persona non grata. He's not coming to the house. I'm not letting him see the grandkids. Now dad finds about that. He's like, I'm going to kill my accountant. I'm going to kill my lawyer. I'm going to kill my financial advisor. I knew I didn't want to talk about this. I didn't want to make these decisions. I knew this was going to happen. I don't want to lose a relationship with my son and my grandkids. I should have just shut my mouth and done nothing, So I could give you 50 of these, but like that's a real life.
This is real life.
What happens? It just does. Mm-hmm. And a lot, especially men, like if a man is running the business, they're like, I don't want to jeopardize my family. Like when I'm dead, let them kill each other. You know what I'm saying? Let them fight when I'm gone. They won't go to the cemetery, whatever.
So it's almost guaranteed. So to your point, your typical family conversation around a business that might be worth 10, 20, 50, 100 million more dollars, let's say. It's a massive asset. And we all know what happens when people pass away and people fight over the will. But to some extent, you're talking about this coming up when the sun is still shining. So dad's 60 now. He wants to sell. He's like maybe starting to talk about it. All of a sudden, it's like a grenade off in the living room. That's what happens?
Look, most people don't do proper succession planning. It's for two reasons. Entrepreneurs always deal with what's an emergency today rather than worrying about tomorrow. So every time a person like myself or you or an accountant or attorney tries to get a client to focus, I'll do it tomorrow. I got 6 fires I got to put out. So that's the first problem. The second is what I just mentioned. They realize they're going to have to make very, very difficult decisions emotionally, not tax-wise, forget money, forget tax, emotional, family, personal decisions that, like, I'm a grandfather. I got 3 grandkids. Like, it would kill me if at some point in my life, like I had a fight with my daughter-in-law, she didn't let me see my grandkids. It would be like, what am I living for? Like, what's the purpose in life at some point? If you have enough money, you want to have for your family. So a lot of people they're so afraid of it. They don't want to deal with it. So they run away from it and they just don't address it. And
so hopefully you're leading us to hopefully a place where you've described a problem that it's crystal clear why it's a problem. How do you get around it?
Look, to be honest, Wes, there are problems that are not solvable. I mean, I'm not a magician. I'm really good at certain things. One thing I'm really good at is, assuming you give me the time to explain at your level, at a lawyer level, like what all the issues are, what are your different choices of how to handle it, and what are the pluses and minuses of every choice. I'm never going to tell you what to do. You got to make that decision. But I'm going to tell you what you could do and what's good or bad. The problem is every single situation has a problem. There is no answer that's a perfect answer. It just doesn't exist. Like, I'll give you a funny thing. I used to do a lot of seminars. I sit down at dinner after the seminar, 4 couples, they don't know each other. Most of the time, they're called.
By the way, so reset the table. So the seminar would be on succession planning, estate planning, selling the business.
Right.
Okay.
You sit down for dinner after the seminar. I got 4 couples and me at the table. They don't know each other. They're strangers. Generally, they're quiet. They're like, Steve, here's my card, call me. Or they like whisper, Steve, let me ask you a question. Could we walk over to the door? But this group, they kind of liked each other. They were like a jovial, fun group. So they sit down. They're like, Steve, come sit down. Like I wasn't even going to go to their table. They like pulled my arm, like sit down. Okay, great. I sit down. So the first one says, Steve, great seminar. Wonderful. But you know what? Simple answer. I'm just going to sell the business because then what do I have to worry? I sell the business, I get my money, and then ultimately my 3 or 4 kids split up the money. Everybody's happy. The next person goes, Bill, just met him. Bill, that's crazy. Like you spent all these years building up this business. Like your kids are in the business. You can't just like sell the business. Like that's crazy. I wouldn't do that. I'm just going to leave the business to all my kids. I don't care if they're in the business or not. The next guy goes, Bobby, what are you crazy? Like you can't leave the business to all your kids when some are in the business or some are not. I'm leaving the business to just my kid in the business, and I'll figure out what to do with the other ones. Then the last guy's, John, like get out of here. Like you can't do that. And he gives me like another scenario.
So they're all, and by the way, they're all right. They're all right.
Right.
Correct?
Then all 4 of them look at me like I'm like, Jesus Christ or somebody. They're like, they look at me they're like, all right, who's right? Who's right? And I'm like laughing. They're like, why are you laughing? I go, because none of you are right and none of you are wrong. Each of you may be making the right choice for you. The other guy may think you're out of your mind, but for you, it could be right. But what my job is when I meet you individually is to tell you what's good about it, but other ways you may want to think about accomplishing the same goal and telling you the pluses and minuses. Then if at the end of the day, you go back to your way, well, all power to you. We signed off to it, and they laughed and they appreciated it. But it's real. There's nobody. It's not like Wes, you're right and Steve's wrong. The only time you're wrong, and this exists a lot. If like you are closed-minded, you're like, Steve, I got my accountant, I got my attorney, I took care of this already. Like what I feel like saying to you is, let's say you're like a plumbing contractor.
Yeah.
If I'm saying, Wes, let me ask you a question. Do you think when the plumbing contractor comes into my house, I have any idea what the hell he's doing? Do I know like he's using the right tools? Do I know like is the problem in my bathtub, in my toilet, in this bathroom? I don't know. You're a plumbing contractor. So with all due respect, how the hell do you know that all your planning was done right? Are you an expert? You're a plumbing contractor. You may be worth $50 million, but you're a plumbing contractor. You're not an expert at this. So like, why are you closed-minded? Why aren't you open to hearing maybe other ways to do things? No disrespect to your advisors. I'm not saying they're bad people, but you know what? If you just listen to 2 or 3 people, they don't know everything. So where the mistake is made, in my opinion, is the lack of openness to talk to other people, to hear different points of view. That's where the error is. Once you hear the different points of view, then
you can make the decision.
Right.
But it's so you can help people solve for any one of those scenarios. So everybody at that table was right, but we don't know if it was right for them.
Right.
The easy, simple one is sell the whole thing, divide up the money. But I look at the second person and I say, yeah, why would you want to sell the whole thing when you could pass it on to the kid that wants to do the business? But then I can see, hey, you can't just leave it to one. It is difficult.
Because every one of them have a problem. If like I'll say to a father, like let's say it's your business, your kid's in the business, you own 100%, you have one kid in the business, and I say, Wes, let me ask you a question, like honestly. Like, give me an honest answer. I know you love your boy in the business. I know he's going to tell me he's a rocket scientist. He's great and all that. But the bottom line is, he's your son. Like, how much of the growth in this business, Wes, came from you versus how much of this came from your son? Like if your business is worth $50 million, how much of it is because of your son and how much of it is because of you? Because if you're going to tell me that your $50 million business is almost all created because of you and your son's had very little to do with it, then what's going to end up happening is your other kids are going to sit there and go, Dad, how the hell can you do that? Like, you built this business. My brother has nothing to do with the business. He's working there, so pay him a salary. But you're going to give him 100% of a business that basically you built up 100% by yourself. Like, that's totally unfair. He's just working there. Versus you bring your son into an RIA and you have $100 million in assets, and your son went to Penn, and he's in the Penn Club, and he's got all of his rich buddy friends, and all of a sudden, your business has $500 million of assets, of which 300 of the 400 is because your son brought in his buddies and his rich parents into the business. Well, damn right, that kid deserves a lot of the business because he grew the business. So you have to look at, like, you have to be fair, because every parent always wants to make their kids out that they're great, but you got to be fair about how much that kid really had to do with the growth of the business.
Yeah, very, very, very true. Well, so I guess my next question would be, is it an all the above solution? And let's just go practical for a minute. If I want to sell a business, and it could be in any one of these areas, it could be electrical contractor, real estate, financial, insurance, safety products, you name it. Where do I go as a business owner to make a sale? If I'm not a private equity target, let's say, where do you go?
Well, it's a combination. Like, your accountant should be able to give you some advice, not just advice from a standpoint of tax issues, but the accountant may have worked with other buyers for other clients, so he may have some people to introduce you to. Clearly, a really good corporate transactional lawyer, because that's all they do. Accountants, a very small piece of their work is buying and selling of businesses, because they don't want their clients to sell because they may lose them as a client. But transactional lawyers, who usually have relationships with they could have with boutique private equity firms. They could have relationships with M&A boutique M&A shops. Then there's business brokers that are out there, and then assuming you have somebody you could trust, like isn't going to spill the beans. If you have a good friend in the industry, you could speak to people in the industry as long as it's kept in confidence, because you don't want that information out in the marketplace. It's a combination of all of those.
Yeah, and the way I look at this is I literally just had a text from one of the families I work with last night that was, hey, I'm thinking about selling part of one of my businesses, and it does this much in revenue, it's got this many employees, it does this much in EBITDA, and it really helps me either figure out, because I've worked with so many companies over the last several years that end up selling, or so many entrepreneurs, let's say, that sell their business. You've got valuation firms, and a lot of these are in Atlanta and the Southeast that I have used. Then you have business brokers, and that are kind of middle to smaller type companies. And then bigger transactions, I would look at these smaller investment banking firms that can put together transactions. And then you keep going even higher up the scale, and then you go to start talking to investment banks that are slightly bigger, and then private equity firms. So it's kind of this long trajectory from, hey, this is $1 million business to this is a $250 million business. And really, there are different pieces of that, almost that the investment banking food chain that can serve all those different markets.
Look, I would say that there's definitely different levels. And, between the big boys and the little boys, that's been a whole industry that's grown. There's a lot of boutique investment banking firms and M&A firms and private equity firms that are going after that company that does, 3 million to 25 million of EBITDA, 25 to a couple of $100 million of sales. It's a big business. There's a lot of the people looking to sell today. So there's a lot of people that have gotten into that space.
So let's talk about kids for a minute here. What is your thought on kids inheriting money? What age makes sense? Do you recommend people, if you're a business owner, you've got lots of, or anyone, high net worth individual, and you've got lots of assets, and when do you think kids, in your experience, start to be fully mature about that?
At 95 years old.
No one's ever said that.
Look, every kid's different. I mean, here's some. I'll give you a couple of general rules of thought that I have. This is my personal feeling. It doesn't mean I'm right. I know what I've done.
Yeah, but you've done this for so many years. You've helped people to plan their estates. Yeah.
I know. So first off, wherever possible, gifts should be in trust rather than outright, because no matter how much you trust your kid, they could get divorced or they could get sued. So for both tax and non-tax reasons, putting gifts in trust for the most part is very important.
Now, when you say gifts, what size gift are you talking about here? What level does it warrant a trust?
Gifts of sharing a company. It could be a piece of real estate, an investment property. It could be money, whatever it is. I'm not talking about you're giving your kids $10,000. I mean, if you want to give your kids $10,000, you give them $10,000. I mean, if you're wealthy enough, I'm not saying put that in trust.
Right.
But any kind of substantive gift, and substantive is different
for everybody,
for each person. But, when you start talking hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars of value of things, you put in trust. But I think it's good. It's good both while you're alive and after you die to give some money to your kids that isn't tied up, because you want to see what they do with it. And so while you're alive, it gives you a sense this is kind of what I thought my son was going to do with the money. More the reason why he's not getting anything outright when something happens to me, or I see what his wife did, or I see what my son-in-law did when they got the money.
Wow. So you're a proponent of kind of the test rocket. Wow. That's interesting. I've never heard that before. 100%. That's a great idea.
100%. And maybe more than once, tested here, then another test a couple of years later, then at death, instruct your trustees, which is the most important part of planning, is your trustees. That's the most complicated.
Let's get to that next. Yeah, I want to talk about that.
By the right people. But I've sat down with my trustees, my wife and I, and first of all, they know my kids forever, but they know our philosophy, what we think. And it's the same thing, give them some stuff, but there's plenty more where it came from. So it's not only are you testing them, but you're also saying, there's a lot more over here. And based on how you handle yourself over here, it's going to dictate what happens over here. So it's good to kind of do that.
Who's the trustee? Because this is complicated for anybody. Who do you put in charge? Who's the executor of the will? Who is the trustee on a trust? Is it just your most trusted person? Is it a corporate trustee? Walk our folks through who's the person that's best at that, and how do you choose them?
Thanks. That's a loaded question. Okay, I'll try my best. All right. So let's look at it from a different standpoint. I'm gonna give the whole answer, which I think your audience appreciate, but I'm gonna kind of move around. So obviously, if you're talking about who's best at doing it, if we said, I want to pick the best person to be trustee who would be the best at that job, well, then you would go to professional trustees that this is what they do for a living, which is Wilmington Trust and Bessemer Trust and the old U.S. Trust, to all these trust departments.
Right. Schwab has one. Fidelity has one now. And those are called, for our listeners, what Steve's talking about here, those are corporate trustees that you essentially outline a long-term plan that could literally last 100 years. You think they're going to be around for a long, long, long time. And then they are the arbiters. They're the gatekeepers for the money, for depending on your wishes, for your kids and your heirs,
right,
correct,
right.
Steve?
So let's go, what's the good and what's the bad? Because there's both. The good are two things. A, this is what they do for a living. They got deep pockets, so if they mess up, they're going to get sued. So they're really careful. Number two, they're objective. There's no like, they're going to side with one kid over another kid. They're going to be moved by somebody talking to them. They're going to be like robotic, like this is what they do for a living. So
these are the rules.
That's the good. There's two or three bads. A, they're expensive because some people could be a trustee and not even charge you, like not professionals, but so they cost money. Number two, most of them manage money, so they lose their objectivity. So if you're going to Bessemer and they're your trustee, who do you think is going to manage the money?
Bessemer.
Who's looking over Bessemer's shoulders to say, man, maybe you're not the best money manager. I'll pay you to be the trustee, but like I want it to be managed by, Blackstone or something, So they're expensive, they're rigid, and they're not objective in the management of the money. So that's the pluses and the minuses. If you go the opposite direction, let's go down the food chain. So the next would be an accountant or an attorney. I picked them to be my trustees.
And by the way, we're giving an example here. Let's say $10 million. You're leaving $10 million.
Right.
Yep.
So I picked my accountant or attorney to be the trustee. Okay, so let's look at the positives and negatives. Positive is they know my family. They have some connection to us. They're not as like sterile as a corporate trustee. They know my family, but there's a lot of negatives. They're not professional trustees. Not what they do for a living. Number two, they're not experts at management of money, and they may be the ones picking who manages the money. And most lawyers and accountants aren't that rich, so it's not like they have so much money that they're so smart at who should be managing the money. So they may not be the best person to do that. All right. Number three, they're going to charge you probably something like what a corporate trustee is going to charge. Typically, it's like 1% or something like that a year that they charge you. And sometimes they're not objective because if there's a business, the accountant may favor the kid who's in the business because that's who the relationship is closest with. He may not be as close with the other kids. Okay. Then you go on the food chain, you go to like family, your kids, they're not the positives. They're not going to charge a fee because it's family. They don't know what the hell they're doing as a trustee. They're probably not expert at managing money. Are you going to pick all your kids and then like the three have to agree on everything? Are you going to pick one kid? So let's use a perfect example, Wes. Bernie Madoff. Everybody knows who Bernie Madoff is.
Sure.
It's like
we'll cue the ominous music.
It's like Bonnie and Clyde. And everybody knows who Bernie Madoff is. So watch this scenario. I'm the dad. You're my son. You sit down, Wes. Listen, when I die, I'm picking you as trustee. You're my oldest son. You're the most responsible. I trust you the most. You're going to watch over the family's money. But let me tell you one thing, Wes. When I die, you are to never, ever, ever sell anything that Bernie Madoff has. Bernie is the smartest guy in the world. He's a genius. I've made more money with him than anybody else. You're not to ever sell. So now dad dies. You're now in charge of the money for your brother and sister. You're going to listen to dad, right? Dad told you, don't sell what Bernie Madoff has, right? Don't. 3 years later, we find out Bernie Madoff's a crook. What's the odds that your brother and sister are going to sue you because they're going to say, you didn't have a diversified portfolio. You left all this money with Bernie Madoff. That was dad's guy. You should have sold out. You should have put it with multiple managers. Okay, watch. They're going to sue you. Now let's watch the other scenario. Dad dies. You say, I don't care what my father said. I'm not leaving the money all with Bernie Madoff. I'm going to diversify it. Turns out Bernie Madoff's not a crook. He really is a genius. And you did that. And now your other managers are doing much worse than Bernie Madoff. Then your brothers and sisters could sue you and say, why the hell did you sell the stuff on Bernie Madoff? Dad had all of his money there. He's a genius. Why did you put it with other managers? And they screwed up. So you can't win if you're a trust. Like, you're going to get sued by your brothers and sisters if one kid is in charge, because you're going to do something that they're going to be a Monday morning quarterback on, no matter what it is that you do.
Wow.
Doesn't mean you're going to lose your lawsuit, but you're going to get sued. So I gave you all these. It just shows you another just level of total complexity where there's no one right perfect answer.
What do you see though in your business? What do you see is the most common way to do it though? What is the most?
Most people pick their family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They don't pick a corporate trustee. Mm-hmm. Most, unless it's like old wealth, like in a wealth that's been around and has used corporate trustees before, like more like first generation. Guy was in World War II, or Korean War, built the business. 85 years old, died. First generation with money, more likely Jewish, Italian, Irish, like immigrant kind of scenario. Doesn't really deal with corporate banks as trustees. They're going to pick their kids normally. They're not going to think about, one of my kids is going to sue my other kid, or what kind of position am I putting my kid in? It's family.
What about leaving multiple children in charge? Is that has its own set of problems, though? Obviously, I've seen that.
Yeah,
too.
If you pick one kid, you have one problem. If you pick all the kids, you have a different problem. They can't sue each other because they're all trustees. But now you can't get anything done because they can't agree on anything.
So what then is the biggest? We've talked about leaving all these different options. What is the biggest mistake people do when it comes to all of this estate planning or family succession? Is it they bury their head in the sand and just don't do anything and just leave it up to the kids, or do you see any tactical mistakes that happen over and over again?
Well, I think if I were to say what are the most common, it's not doing anything, like putting your head in the sand a little bit and just say I could do it tomorrow, or waiting too long to do planning where you can't really do it. I would say the second biggest mistake is the thought of, I'm just going to leave everything equal to everybody, even when there's family businesses involved, and not to say that that's wrong, but not to say, if I'm going to do that, what other things do I have to kind of do so that that's not going to be as big of a problem as it would be if I didn't do anything, So I would say, and then the other problems I mentioned earlier, lack of an open mind to speak to other people and get different ideas, and to just like be in your little cocoon of your accountant and your lawyer and not letting anybody else in to give you ideas and thoughts. And then also being afraid to talk to your children, so that when you're gone, they're going to learn about a lot of this stuff for the first time. I would say those are probably like four of the major problems that I find.
So doing nothing, / waiting, the thinking that you need to leave everything equally to everybody. 3, lack of open mind to get other opinions or outside counsel to some extent. Hey, what should I do outside of your CPA or attorney? And then maybe 4 here is just you're afraid to talk to the kids. And as they get older, I keep thinking about Succession, the show on I think it's an HBO show.
Oh, it's a great show.
Is that not an amazing show?
Oh, it's a great show.
It'll be back this fall, but I need to play the theme music of Succession for this podcast. But it just makes it tough, right? I mean, if you've seen that movie, or you've seen that show on HBO, you've got the family dynamics, the patriarch of the family constantly trying to either hold power, but then try to relinquish some power, but then really not wanting to relinquish power. And it's a magnified version of what happens in real life. And I think if you would actually just talk to your children and have them sit down, and hopefully they're adult enough to do so, that's when then so many of these problems get solved. You talk to the kids, come to professionals like you, go to your advisor that can help facilitate that. Go to somebody like Steve, who's done this so many times, to give you what I like. Your thought here is that You're able to give people kind of here are the 4 different things you could do, and here are the positives and negatives of each one. And I love that, Steve.
See, I think the problem, Wes, when you go to the show Succession, which is, it's a great show, the father has so mentally destroyed all of those kids for so many years that it's beyond repair. Like, that's a non-repairable situation because they're all completely wackadoodles in the family because the father is such a horrible human being of how he's treated his family that and that happens. That's not something that doesn't ever exist. There are a lot of, more so dads than moms, there are a lot of dads who have just like beaten down their kids so badly and like just treated them like babies or like just treated them horribly that the kids lack total confidence. They become drug addicts, drinkers, and sometimes then you can't do anything. It's beyond repair.
And do you think that again, we hear the short sleeves to shirt sleeves and 2 generations or 3 generations. Does money ruin these people? Do you see that money can clearly ruin the next generation, or is that? Do you think that's a little bit of a myth?
I think there's clearly truth to that. I mean, there's clearly truth to that. Whether it's ruined them, look. I came from a certain environment. My kids have come from a different environment. And I'm not saying that it's bad that my kids aren't like me, but my kids, there's part of me they just can't understand. They just can't, and it's like they've been brought up in a different world. I'm just using me as an example. They've been brought up in a totally different world than I was brought up in. And maybe I would be a better person if I had been brought up, some things I would have learned from being brought up like them. And I think they could be better overall characters if they had learned some of the things I learned growing up, But some of that, it is what it is. So, and trust me, my kids are great kids. And it's not like money's made them bad, but it's different. Like in Succession, you're talking about so much money. I mean, you're talking about like billionaire kind of, money. That, yeah, I mean, if these kids are with drugs and alcohol, I mean, how many kids, are of the richest people, you read their stories, they're in rehab, they die at early ages, they commit suicide. Obviously, the money and the power of typically their father, like, and a lot of powerful men, what do powerful men do? They end up not being the greatest husbands, they cheat on their wives, they have mistresses, leads to divorces, multiple divorces, kids from multiple families. Every one of those things just adds to the dynamics.
The complexity and the dynamics of it, yeah. Maybe that's why the happiest retirees get to 500 grand and above. They don't need to get to 5 billion and above. Right. You certainly don't need to be a billionaire to be a happy retiree. So last question about life insurance. I know that you're a proponent of life insurance in some situations. Where do you see that as an advantage or disadvantage, and what makes sense to you in utilization of life insurance?
Well, there's different situations. Let's put aside, the young person with young kids starting out that doesn't have any money. I mean, common people buy life insurance, term insurance, just to protect their family if something happens to them. Normally, when I'm involved in insurance, it's part of people's planning. So usually there's 3 or 4 places that most commonly you find life insurance used in sophisticated planning. Number 1 is very wealthy people who have illiquid estates because they have big businesses that are going to have big estate taxes when they die. Many of them use life insurance to provide liquidity for their children to pay those taxes so they don't take on these big burdens to the IRS to come up with the money to pay the tax. So that's one of the most common. Second common area is...
And again, that would be for 50 million plus type businesses.
It could be a little less. It depends on what the estate laws are. 30-ish million and up kind of.
30 million and up, yep.
Okay, then you have... I'm leaving the business to Wes, and I'm going to go buy a big life insurance policy for Bill and Fran because I don't have enough other assets to leave them. And I don't want to take a chance that I could die before I build up enough other assets. So I'm going to buy a nice insurance policy and trust for my other two kids. So this way, when I die and Wes gets the business, my other kids, they're not going to get equal, but at least they get something of substance.
And so it's a balancer. So you can do it as a balancer. Yeah. Life insurance as an equalizer a little bit. Yeah.
That's a second scenario. Third scenario is second marriages. I have a spouse. I'm a wealthy person. I have a prenup, and my spouse is not going to get a lot if something happens to me. I'm going to leave most of it to my kids from my first marriage. So I buy an insurance policy for the benefit of my spouse as a way to leave her something, or him, it could be a him, to leave something so that, I could pass my assets, to my kids, and I'm still kind of taking care of her. So that would be another area. Another area is buy-sell planning. Wes, you and I, you mentioned before you're in business with your brothers. We have
my original partner's sons who are brothers. Yeah, they're brothers. Yeah,
step brothers. Let's say you're in partnership with. So you're like, okay, I need a buy-sell agreement with them. What happens if I die? What happens if they die? We buy each other out. I don't want to be partners with my stepbrother's wife. They don't want to be partners with my wife. So, there's others.
Exactly. Yeah. The buy-sell is, I think, a really important one, because if you have you have a couple partners in a business, one passes away and the value of it might be millions, but the partners may not be able to buy it out immediately. So life insurance solves for that, to then buy out the spouse. And now at least the insurance is a really, really effective tool in helping business owners have a succession plan as well. So that's important.
I'll give you a very good example for your listeners. Create one of my more creative ideas. You and I are 50-50 owners in a business, and you have a kid in the business and I have a kid in the business, and I don't want to be partners with your kid and you don't want to be partners with my kid. So we have a buy-sell agreement to buy each other out. So I die, you collect $10 million, you pay my wife. Now you just added $10 million to your estate because you went from owning half the business to 100% of the business, and you did it with insurance. So you're worth $10 million more. Now you're going to sit down with your lawyer to try to plan how to pass the business to your son or daughter in the business. So what I would do differently is I would give my son one share of non-voting stock. You would give your son one share of non-voting stock. And basically what would end up happening is I would then bonus my kid money to buy insurance on you. You would bonus your kid money to buy insurance on me. Now, when I die, instead of when I die, you buying me out, your son buys me out. And now what happens? Your son ends up getting half the business. You have half. And we just passed $10 million of value down to the next generation with basically no gift implications. So those are like some of the creative things that I try to do for business people when they're doing planning.
And that's why you're the author of Business Succession Planning, a guide to transfer sales, family harmony, and minimizing litigation, which are really, those are the things that we talked about today. So Steve, awesome. I love this topic, as you can tell. It's really fun to dive in and get to some of the meat and potatoes of all of the things that we maybe think about, particularly if you own a business, of how to get it right to the next generation. And then even if you don't own a business, how do you have your heirs in a good place and they're not squabbling and they don't sue each other? And I think that we answered a lot of those questions here today. So a lot to think about, and you presented it in a wonderfully interesting way. So thank you, Steve.
No, Wes, thanks for having me. I like to try to do it in a way that isn't too technical and people could put their hands around it.